of their household. Robert and Barry became close friends with Robert Skews. He also lived in Salisbury North. Skews had suffered from mild brain damage since his birth. He lived in an absolute squalor. Food scraps and rubbish littered the floor of his house, which also smelt strongly of cat and dog urine. It was whilst visiting Skews one day that Robert Wagner and Barry Lane met the newly married John Bunting and Veronica Tripp, who had just moved into their new home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road, Salisbury North, right next door to Robert Skews. If there was one thing John Bunting hated as much as authority and pedophiles, it was people who were gay. There is obviously a very big difference between pedophiles and people who are gay, but to John, they were the same. He couldn't or wouldn't see the difference. So given this hatred and what he used to get up to with his mate Benny back in Queensland, you might find it odd that he struck up a close relationship with Robert Wagner. For whatever reason, John saw something in Robert, and he was able to look past the fact he was in a gay relationship. It may well have been because he heard Robert's story and the fact that their relationship started when Robert was a young teenager. He may have been able to relate and sympathise with that. And as much as John liked Robert, he hated Barry Lane. Couldn't stand him. Referred to him as a faggot and a freak, and constantly rubbished him behind his back. He only put up with Barry because of Robert Wagner. Salisbury North, where they all lived, is part of a cluster of low-income, low-cost government housing suburbs north of Adelaide in South Australia, on the outskirts of the city. Unemployment is high. Instead, people rely on government assistance pensions and unemployment benefits. It's an area filled with vulnerable people, disillusion and despair. The crime rate is high, and the prospects for many of the people there are low. John was a dominating, controlling type of person. Not the biggest man, but few rarely argued with him. He had a certain something about him. People knew better than to mess with him. He didn't hide his love of violence and torture either. He would talk to anyone who would listen about what he considered to be the evil in the world, the pedophiles. He often fantasised about ways he could punish and hurt them. The people who were listening and were taken in by John's rants were Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden. They hung off his every word, drawn in by the spell of John Bunting. Barry Lane often hung around too, although John didn't make him feel very comfortable. Like his mate Robert Wagner, John was also into neo-Nazi views and white power. The two of them even joined a white power group for a period of time, but they were kicked out because they were considered too extreme. Another person who Robert and Barry were friends with was Clinton Trezise. Clinton was a drifter who had a tough childhood, being brought up in various foster homes. Clinton struggled through school before eventually leaving. He made his way through various church groups before moving to Salisbury North, where he rented a flat nearby Robert and Barry. Clinton was excited to have a place to call his own. He was a carefree individual with a happy-go-lucky attitude. He was openly gay, and not long after moving in, he befriended Barry and Robert, and it was through them that he met John Bunting. John Bunting couldn't stand Trezise. With his flamboyant taste in clothes and proudly gay persona, John hated him. And one day in August 1992, Clinton Trezise disappeared. Some people around the area did notice Clinton seemed to have disappeared, but no one seemed to care too much. After all, he was a drifter. He was obviously just back up to his old tricks. John Bunting's wife, Veronica, certainly wasn't overly concerned by his disappearance. And she still wasn't concerned when Barry Lane turned up at her doorstep one day, nervously detailing how her husband, John Bunting, had killed Clinton. Veronica had heard one too many of Barry's stories. We're talking about a person who told people he once fell pregnant and that he gets regular periods just like women. Barry loved telling stories that weren't true, and Veronica believed this was just another one of those. Veronica did mention the story to John when he got home. She laughed it off. Crazy Barry at it again. John didn't say too much when she told the story, but when she was finished, John said Barry was a bullshitter with a big mouth, and to just ignore what he said. Veronica agreed. She never really liked Barry anyway. But Barry wasn't done. A little while later, he went back and saw Veronica again, this time with more details to try and convince her. Barry told her it happened in her house, 203 Waterloo Corner Road. They were all sitting around talking when John crept up behind Clinton and hit him over the head with a shovel. Clinton collapsed to the ground and John kept hitting him in the head until he was dead. Then John made Barry and Mark Hayden help him dispose of Clinton's body. They put Clinton in the back of Barry's station wagon and drove him to the town of Lower Light, which was about 20 minutes away. They buried him in a paddock in a shallow grave. Clinton was aged 22. Barry begged Veronica not to tell John what he had said, but she did. This time John didn't deny any of it. He erupted at Barry's big mouth, called him a filthy faggot that couldn't keep his mouth shut. John gives Veronica her own warning. Say anything to anyone and you'll end up like the person at Lower Light. So shut the fuck up. Veronica didn't mention it again. 2 farmers found the body of Clinton in 1994. The police were called and started an investigation. The forensic pathologist determined the cause of death was traumatic brain injury. But they couldn't identify Clinton's body. Police arranged for a facial reconstruction to be completed and released to the media, as well as a reward of $100,000 for any information. But nobody came forward. The police couldn't match the remains to any of their missing person records either. His remains were stored at the State Forensic Science Centre. Identity unknown. Clinton's sister did report him missing after he disappeared, but no official report was taken. It wasn't until his mother came forward in 1995 that police looked into it more. They became interested when they saw Clinton hadn't accessed his disability pension since 1992. A photo of Clinton was sent to the Forensic Science Centre, but they failed to match him to the remains found at Lower Light. Clinton would remain unidentified for several more years. Another important person in this story is Elizabeth Harvey. Elizabeth's mother didn't really want her and resented her growing up. Elizabeth and her sisters were first touched by their stepfather when they were very young. Elizabeth was only 7. By the time they were teenagers, their stepfather was raping them. Elizabeth's mother knew too, but she didn't care. She called her daughters sluts for chasing after her man. When Elizabeth was 16, she started dating boys. Her mother would try and seduce her boyfriends when she brought them over. Elizabeth attempted suicide when she was 17. She got very close, but it was her mother who saved her and got her medical help just in time. She gave birth to her first son, Troy Yude, when she was in her early 20s. The father of Troy didn't want anything to do with him or her. She ended up marrying another man, Spiros, who was much older than her. It was an ugly, violent relationship. Spiros would badly beat Elizabeth and rape her. She ended up having 3 sons to him. The first was Jamie Vlasakis. And it wasn't long before Spiros started sexually assaulting his children as well. Troy and Jamie were both victims of that.